Hilchos Keilim Perek Shmini, the laws of utensils, chapter 8. This class is being recorded a day late. Today is Sunday, Tez Zayin Adar, the 16th of Adar. Yesterday was the 15th. It's supposed to be for Shabbos, but I couldn't record it on Friday because Purim was such a busy day. So we're recording it today, the day after. We are embarking on a journey within a journey. We're within a very large set of laws. For the next 4 days, we're going to be dealing exclusively with klei matchos, the laws of metal utensils. As we've seen, the Rambam is building up to discuss the different categories of utensils. We had 3 chapters on wood, a chapter on leather. Now we're starting metal. Each chapter is going to introduce 1 or 2 or more rules that relate to the contraction or the susceptibility of metal utensils to become impure, with multiple examples of each principle. Today, the main principles that we're going to be dealing with are the idea of golmei kli matchos. Golmei kli matchos means unfinished metal utensils, and the principle that a metal utensil can only become susceptible to becoming tamei if it's completely finished. If any part of it is unfinished, it's not able to become tamei. We're also going to be dealing with the laws of weaponry, metal weaponry, and what's called tachshitim, adornments or jewelry. And that's going to lead into an interesting conversation because we're going to see that there's certain things that are adornments for humans and adornments for animals, and how there's a difference if something is an adornment for a human or for an animal. If it serves a human, it can become impure. If it serves an animal, typically it cannot become impure. And that's going to lead into a conversation about the power of thought and intention versus action in rendering a utensil susceptible to become impure, as we shall see later on in the chapter. So we begin with the basic principle about golmei klei matchos. Says the Rambam Malacha Aleph, kol klei matchos, all metal utensils, einon mekablin tuma, are not able to become impure at all, ad shetigomer melachton kula, until their entire processing work is complete, fully. And the utensil will not lack any sort of action at all to render it ready for use. Avol, however, golmei klei matchos, unfinished metal utensils, that means even up to the very last point, it's missing some kind of action to render it fit. Einon mekablin tuma, at that point they're still locked, unsusceptible to becoming impure at all. Halacha beis, ve'eluhein golmei klei matchos, what are considered unfinished metal utensils? So the Rambam gives a number of examples, and I got to say today there's going to be many, many pictures, and I'm very, very indebted to AI for the help that it gave me in preparing these pictures, that you can understand these laws a little better. So here we begin. What are examples of unfinished metal utensils? Kol she'osid lo shuf oisai, any metal dish or utensil which you're still planning to smooth down or to polish. That's lashuf. Oi l'shabetz. L'shabetz, as the commentaries explain, means to add an accessory or a decorative adornment that's not part and parcel of the utensil itself. For example, nailing a bunch of nails in a pattern onto a metal utensil or metal dish, that's called l'shabetz. So if you're still planning to l'shabetz this metal utensil, so the metal utensil is not fully ready. Oi legared. Legared means to file it down with a plane, to make it fully smooth. Oy lecharkev. Lecharkev is to create a decorative pattern on the metal dish in and of itself. So carving in or engraving into the metal, not like nails from without. That would be l'shabetz. Lecharkev is to design from the utensil itself. Oy lehakish bekurnos, or to knock it into shape by using a hammer. Or it was missing an ear, or a oigen, I'm going to translate as rim. This we'll actually get to later on in this set of laws. I'm just borrowing it from the clay, pictures of the clay utensils. This is from the Art Scroll Mishnayos. The oizen, the ear, has 2 interpretations from different places in the Rambam. It arises different implications. One is like this: they used to have handles on utensils, and the way they used to do it was they had little protrusions coming out of the clay utensil into which they would stick the handle. So the oizen is this, like an ear that kind of sticks out of a person's body. So too does the oizen stick out of the utensil, and the handle can go inside of it. That's in one place that Rambam implies that. In other places, the oizen is actually simply like a handle of sorts. The whole handle is called the oizen by the Rambam in other places. As far as an oigen, also different interpretations. Some say oigen means a rim coming out at the top of a utensil. Some say oigen means the neck of elongated utensils. That's the oigen. Anyway, this utensil, this metal utensil, don't get confused, this is clay pictures, but apply it to metal in your mind. If a metal utensil is missing an ear or this neck or this rim, Hareze eine mekabel tuma. So all of these utensils are not even susceptible to becoming impure ad sheyetaknehu v'yeyapeyu, until you fix it in the case where it needs fixing, or you beautify it in the case where the beautification is missing. V'lo tishar b'malacha klal, and no work shall remain at all. It has to be fully ready to go. Ketzat. Now let's get some specific examples. The Rambam first just gave us examples of the types of actions. But now let's go to specific utensils and see what their finishing actions might be. Kegoin hasayif. Let's begin with a sword. A sword, she'einu mekabel tuma ad sheyeshufenu. It's not susceptible to becoming impure until you do what's called stropping. Stropping, at least, today it means sharpening the sword, but it gives it like the final edge. It helps the cut be extra sharp. It also is what makes the mirror effect on the sharp metal. It basically removes the last imperfections. So typically in the olden days it was done by taking a little piece of leather, which was lined with oil, and you would strop, you would sharpen the sword that way. So a sword is not considered to be fully in use until this is done to it. And until then, it's not mekabel tuma. It's not able to become impure at all. The hasaki, and when it comes to a knife, ad sheyashchizena, it's not considered to be usable until you sharpen it. And as the commentaries to the Mishnah and also to the Rambam explain, that basically without sharpening the knife fully so that its blade is fully functional, it's not really usable. And so it's still missing malacha. If it's still missing ma'aseh, it's not mekabel tuma. V'chein kol kayetzer b'ma'aseh elu, and the same is true of all such similar actions for similar types of metal utensils. Lefichach, therefore, says the Rambam, a very interesting new law arises from this difference between unfinished and finished metal utensils. And that's going to be that if something in its initial state goes into the halachic category of unfinished metal utensils, even if you then take that and turn it into a beautiful utensil, it's still not going to be mekabel tuma, because in its initial form, it was golmei klei unfinished metal utensils. Look at this. Ha'oise Keilim min ha'eshes shel barzel. Somebody makes a dish out of iron ore. Iron ore, so by default, it's very impure. Impure not in the ritual sense, I mean impure like it has a bunch of impurities or imperfections. And because of that, when you take raw ore and you try turning it into a dish, you're not able to ever do the standard refinement process to the utensil. It always remains in some sort of way, unfinished, lower quality. And therefore, the dish that you make out of it is never called complete. Same thing, oymin hacharara shel matches. Or if you take what's called a metal ingot. Charara means like a cake, because typically these ingots were shaped like cakes of some sorts. Basically, you would take a bunch of metal ore, again, make it into this circular shape, and from this circular shape, you would turn it into a dish. So this charara shel barzel, shel matches, is never considered finished. Also missing some level of perfection, some level of full purity, and therefore whatever dish you make out of it will never be considered to be complete. Umin hasoivev shel galgal, from the hoop of a wheel. In ancient times, the wagon wheels were made out of wood, and around the wheel they would put a little metal band to protect it when it would roll on the floor from bumps in the road, from rocks, from different things. So this metal band was, of course, just made to protect the wheel. You take that metal and you turn it into a dish. You're taking a piece of golmei klei matches and trying to make it into a keli. It's never going to be mekabel tuma. Same thing is umin hatasin. Umin hatasin is thin sheet metal. So it's made to be used in other functions. And you're taking it now and trying to make a dish out of it. Umin hatzipuyin. Tzipuyin is silver as it's been prepared for plating. Again, it's not ever taking a form of a finished utensil, and you're taking that silver and trying to make it into a utensil. Umikane hakelim. And from the bases of utensils, I'll go back to that picture with the clay, just to show you. The kan is a base. It could technically, if you turned it over, function as a utensil onto its own, but in its original form, it's a golmei klei matches. It's unfinished. Same thing from the oigen, from the rim, or from the neck, or the oizen, whatever way you want to interpret that, whether it's just a little protrusion or the full handle. Umin hashchailes. Shchailes is scrap metal, but specifically scrap metal that is scrapped in the process of making a utensil. So let's say here you're trying to cut down a piece of metal to size, and as you're cutting the piece of metal to size, these little pieces fall away. That's called shcheles. Umin hagroides. Groides is metal filings. So go back to that picture of the plane. Where is that? Excuse me. When you're filing down this utensil, smoothing it down, these little filings come out. So again, they never had the form of a finished utensil. To begin with, they were always just pieces of scrap metal, unfinished utensils. So all of these things will be pure forever, even once they take the form of a dish. Because all of these things which were now made, and are really in essence unfinished metal utensils. By the way, there's some discussion in the commentaries. What happens if you take this groides or this shcheles, this scrap metal, and you melt it down, and now you turn it into a dish? Perhaps when you melt it down, now it's considered like making a new dish, and the dish could be considered to be a full klei matris, and might become tamei according to some opinions. Aval, however, says the Rambam, to contrast this, let's say a person takes broken pieces, fragments of a metal utensil. So in their initial form, they were a full metal utensil. They didn't just fall off because you were cutting a piece of metal to size. This used to be a metal bowl, and then it cracked into a bunch of pieces. And now you're taking these cracked pieces and making them into a utensil. Same thing as if you take utensils that themselves deteriorated because of wear and tear, because of time passing, and you turn those into new, renewed utensils. Same thing again, they began as a full utensil. Follow this. You make a utensil out of a nail which came from a utensil. So imagine there was a metal dish, okay? This metal dish was cut down to size, it was made into a nail. So the nail now comes from a full utensil. Now this nail was further cut down and made into a little needle, let's say, as the commentators give the example. So now you have a keli that was made out of a nail that was for sure made out of a utensil. So again, in its initial form, it was a full utensil. So all of these things, all of these dishes could become tamei because they were never in an unfinished state. But for example, if you had a nail where we don't know if they were formed from an original dish or just from ore, metal ore, in which case, again, the metal ore is always considered to be keilim, it's never fully perfected. So the nail which you made out of it really is considered to be a golmei klei matris. Then the nails remain pure. Even if you turn them into a utensil, for example, you made a needle out of them. So a needle out of a nail, but the nail itself, you don't know if it came from a real keli or just from ore. They can never become tamei because of the fact that they may have come from a golmei klei matris, which cannot become tamei. Halacha gimel. Klei matris she'enim mechuser ela kisoy. You have a full metal dish that's lacking nothing but a cover. A metal pot, it needs a cover. That's not called golmei klei matris. Mekabel tuma. The dish itself, the pot itself, could become tamei. She'ena kisoy chashuv miguf hakli, because the cover is not considered to be part of the body of the utensil. The utensil itself is complete. Halacha dalid machat. You have a needle, talking about needles over here. Shaloi nikva. But this needle, you didn't make the hole at the top. You didn't make the eye of the needle. Eloshafa v'tikna lekach mitchilasa. You smoothed it down, you fixed it in shape, but without the eye. To begin with, this is the way it is, just a raw needle. Mikabeles tuma. Even though relative to, let's say, sewing needles, which require an eye, it's considered to be an unfinished utensil, but there are many ways to use a needle in this state without the eye. And therefore, it's already at this point able to become tamei because, for example, it could be used to remove a splinter. But if in your plans was to make an eye, then even though now in its current state you can use it to remove a splinter, but since in your mind you're planning to make it with an eye, so as long as it doesn't have that eye, it remains like a golmei klei matris and is not able to become tamei. Halacha hey. The Rambam now kind of takes a break just to note an interesting contrast between metal utensils and wooden utensils. Right here we just explained that unfinished metal utensils are pure. They cannot never become tamei. But 3 days ago in chapter 5, the Rambam said, the golmei klei eitz tmein. When it comes to wooden utensils, even if they're unfinished, they could become impure. And then, in chapter 1, if you remember, we said, upshute klei matches tmein, flatware, non-receptacle metal utensils are able to become impure. Whereas upshute klei eitz to hoiden din Torah, wooden flatware, at least by biblical law, is pure, never able to become tameh. So what emerges an interesting thing. Nimtza comes out, hatame b'klei eitz, Torah b'klei matches. Whatever is potentially impure when it comes to wooden utensils, like unfinished products, is pure when it comes to metal utensils, as we just said. The hatame b'klei matches, but what's impure, or potentially impure when it comes to metal, the pshutim, Torah b'klei eitz, is completely pure when it comes to wooden utensils. And this is a rule also expressed in the Talmud, just as a way to remember certain laws, that what's pure by metal is impure by wood, and what's pure by wood is impure by metal. Halacha vav. Moving on to the next category within metal utensils, weaponry. Kol klei hamilchama. All vessels, utensils used in war. Like for example a sword. The haroimach, and reimach typically means a spear. Here we're actually referring to only the spear head, which is always metal. The spear itself could be the shaft, could be also wood. So the reimach here is the spearhead. The hakoiva, and the metal helmet. The hashiryon, and the coat of mail. That's this over here. That was a way they used to, part of the armor was the mail coat. The hamagofayim, and the metal shoes or boots that's used by soldiers, the chayetzeben and things like that, mekablin tumam, they are able to become tameh. They're considered to be fully functioning utensils. Additionally, v'chol tachshite ha'adam, all jewelry pieces or adornments that are used by human beings, by people, kegoin hakatla, for example, a type of a necklace, a choker. Many times it had beads, diamonds, was made of metal at its core. So it goes into the category of klei matches. The hanizamim, nizamim are either earrings or nose rings. The hatabois are finger rings. Bein sheyesh alein chaysam, bein she'en alein chaysam, whether or not they have a signet on them, and we'll get back to the signet soon. The chayetzeben are things like them. Mekablin tuma, all of these jewelry adornments are also able to become tameh as well. Afilu dinar shenifsal, even if the jewelry is only in its current state, it wasn't always a piece of jewelry. You took a coin that went out of circulation, the hiskinoi lisloise betzavra ketana, and he set it up into a pendant to hang it onto the neck of a young girl. Mekabel tuma. At this point, now it's converted into jewelry. Now it's a keli, and now it's able to become tameh. V'chein kameya shel matches, also a metal amulet. Either the amulet itself is made of metal, or it's a casing for a parchment amulet, as it used to typically be, but the casing was metal. Mistame kechol tachshite adam, since it was worn as jewelry, it can become tameh like any other jewelry of humans. By the way, just a quick note about the coin, the pendant. The Rambam says dinar shenifsal. It has to be out of circulation, but some commentaries note that it could even be if it's not out of circulation. Just people typically wouldn't use circulable coins as a pendant. They would use them for money. But really it includes even a case where there's a coin still in circulation. If you put it into a pendant, the pendant now is able to become tameh. Halacha zayin. Kol tachshite habehema v'hakelim. Adornments and jewelry of humans are able to become tameh. However, adornments and jewelry of animals and adornments of utensils, that means you have a utensil on which you place an adornment, as we'll see in a second. Like for example, rings that you put around the neck of an animal, again for beauty, not just for like a tag to know where they are. Or la'azne hakelim, a ring which you put around a handle of a utensil. This is the best I could come up with, but I was thinking more like a loose ring, a ring going around the handle of the utensil. That's a tachshit of keilim, adornment for a utensil. Tahirin. These are all fully pure. Ve'enon mekablin tuma bifnei atzman. They can never become impure on their own. As they are, of course, if they're attached to the utensil and the utensil becomes tameh, then all its accessories also become tameh. But just on its own, it's not able to become tameh. Chutz, except for mizug shel behema v'kelim, a bell that hangs around an animal's neck, or a bell that hangs around a utensil. Hamashmiya koil la'adam, since it's there to make sounds for people, so it's considered to be serving people, not serving the animal. And once something is in the category of serving people, it is able to become tameh. Ketzad, what does this look like? So, we know what a bell of an animal looks like, that's obvious. But what does a bell of a utensil look like? Ha'oise zugin lemachteshes. A person makes a bell that's attached to a mortar. When you grind, it's good to have rhythmic sounds. In fact, every morning in Karbanis we say that when they used to grind the ketairas, the person who was supervising used to say, Hadek, hetev, hetev, hadek, used to announce, grind well, because sound is good for the grinding. Not sure scientifically what that means. If anyone knows, please fill us in on YouTube in the comments. But somehow there's an element of sound that could enhance grinding. So people would actually make bells to be hung or attached to mortars. Arisa, people would make bells to hang on or next to a crib for children, a cradle. The tinkling helped lull the baby to sleep. Sfarim, and the bells that are attached to the covers, to the cloths that would cover Torah scrolls, as we have today. Many have bells on the bottom. It helps make a sound. It helps know that a Torah is coming. The commentaries say that in those days it was a way for the teachers to get kids to come back to class. He would carry on, not of course a holy Torah scroll, but a regular, whatever scroll they were using to study from in their classroom, and he would ring the bells and they would come back. Bells that were placed on the cloaks of kids, just to know where they are. They used to hang bells on the bottom and it would make noise, and you always know you can never lose your kid. So all of these are considered to be bells that service the utensils. They don't service people, and therefore they are pure. Now what do you mean? I just gave you examples. I was saying that it gets the kids to come, or it helps you not lose the kid. So why isn't, or it lulls the baby to sleep. So why is it not considered to be something which is there to help a person? So the Rambam immediately clarifies by giving you this caveat. Asalahen in boilin, once you make a clapper for the bells, then mekablin tuma, then they become impure. In other words, the first case that Rambam was just saying, when you make the bell itself, the body of the bell. Since the body of the bell makes no noise at this point, even though the intention is to use it for that, whatever it is, so at that point, it's completely pure. But once you make the clapper that now allows the bell to make a sound, so then of course, it's able to become tameh. Since they're meant to cause sound that's heard by people, they become like jewelry used by people. And the novelty goes even further, that even if the clapper was ultimately removed, mekablin tuma, they continue to be able to become tameh, because at one point they were tameh, and even now, technically speaking, they could be used to make some noise, because you're able to take the bell and bang it onto another piece of clay or pottery and make a nice sound. Yeah, that wouldn't be the initial use, so when it's in its initial form without the clapper, it's not yet mekabel tuma, but once you put the clapper in and it became a fully functioning utensil, now that the clapper's taken out, we still treat it as somewhat functioning and still attach the laws of tuma to it. Halacha ches, zug he'asui le'adam, a bell made for people. So we gave one example before of a bell that's made for kids to wear on their clothing, but now we're actually talking about a bell that's worn around the neck of a person. Im nasa lekatan, if it's made for a child, and it'll be the same reason. They wear a bell around their neck to know where they are. Ein mekabel tuma, ella be'inbel shaloi. It is not able to become tameh except after the clapper is installed. Shari lekil nasa, because then it was made for producing sound, at which point it becomes in service of people, and then it becomes able to become tameh. Im nasa legadol, however, if it was made for an adult, like for a slave, for example, the commentaries to the Talmud say, so then is a tachshit. Then it becomes into a status of jewelry, and it's able to become tameh even without a clapper, because not only is it an issue of mashmiya koil adam, it's an issue of tachshit. It's decorative, and if it's decorative, something decorative for people, we said before in halacha vav, is mekabel tuma. Halacha tes, kol hapartzufos mekables tuma. All busts, like little statues of heads, of faces, partzuf, is able to become tameh. Interestingly, not so much because it's a utensil, but as the commentaries say, because of the laws of avodah zarah. Any bust that's made in service of idol worship becomes tameh like idols. I mean, we saw that in earlier in this book, that one of the things the rabbis decreed impurity on was avodah zarah. So since these busts are typically associated with avodah zarah, they are all able to become tameh. V'chol ha'chaisamais tohirin. All signets, by default, are pure. Chutz michaisam shel matchis shechaismin by bilvad. Except for a signet that's made of metal and that's actually used for signing, for sealing. Then it's a metal utensil that's not a golmei, not unfinished, and then it can become tameh. V'chol ha'tabois tohirais. all rings are pure, chutz mitabas etzba, except for finger rings. Now, what are all rings referring to? So all rings, we'll soon see some exceptions in Rambam himself, but Rashi in Maseches Shabbos says that this could also be referring to a ring that's around the door, not for a bell. I know this picture was more for a bell, just a ring hanging as an adornment on a door. So that's considered a ring that's pure. It doesn't have a function that serves people directly. Aval tabas shecheger bo'es masna, but let's say a ring that's used to tie around your waist as a way to close a belt, being safe of, or it's used to tie a piece of clothing around your shoulders, as was common in those days. Tahira. These rings are pure, even though seemingly this would seem like some kind of an adornment. But as the commentaries explain, no, it's a tachshit of a keli. This is not called a decorative adornment for a human. This is a decorative element of a utensil, of the clothing. And therefore it's not considered to be mekabel tuma. Tabas hasher shel behema. A ring that hangs at the end of a chain that's led to use an animal. This is the best I could come up with. You have a chain around the horse. There's a ring that the person is using to lead the animal. Since it serves the person uses it to lead the animal, to pull the animal, mekabelas tuma. So it can become tamei. It's vulnerable or susceptible to becoming tamei. V'chein makel shel behema shel matches. Same thing as if you have a makel means a stick, but it refers to a prod that you use to prod animals. Rashi gives an example of a camel or of a bear that's being prodded by this prod. Again, since the person makes use of it, mekabelas tuma, it's able to become tummy. But by default, things related to just animals, not to people, are not able to become tummy. So knowing this concept that we just explored, that there's a difference between things that serve humans and things that serve animals, that Rambam now opens up a very interesting concept. Halacha yud, kol hakelim, and you have to keep track here. All utensils, yerdin lituma b'machshava, can go down into a state of being potentially able to become impure, and I'm using my words carefully here. So a utensil can become vulnerable to tuma b'machshava, simply by designation or intent in the mind, thought. However, ve'ein oilin midei tuma ela b'shinei maisa. They cannot exit that vulnerability unless you do an action to them. Now, the Rambam will soon give an example directly, but I want to just speak it out just so you understand. Using the cases before, a utensil which serves a person is able to become tamei. A utensil which serves an animal is unable to become tamei. So to convert something from serving an animal to serving a human and now making it vulnerable to tuma, all that takes is a thought. In your mind, you have to want to designate it for human use. But if you have something that's meant for a human, and now you want to take it into animal use, which is called oilin midei tuma, so you want it to leave the status of being vulnerable to impurity and now become fully pure, for that you must do an action. Thought is not enough. Another related rule, v'hamaiseh mevatel miyad hamaiseh umiyad hamachshava. A deed can cancel the effects of a previous deed or a previous thought, whereas v'hamachshava eina mevateles le miyad hamaiseh v'le miyad hamachshava. Another thought cannot follow up to an action and undo it, neither can it undo a previous thought designation. And now let's get some specifics, examples. Ketzat. Tabas behema oy Keilim. Let's return to the case of the ring that's adorning a goat. Where's my picture there? Okay, this is a tabas behema. Or tabas Keilim, a ring around the utensil, but let's go with the animal, okay? That's easier to remember. A ring for an animal or a ring for utensils, shechoshav aleha lahachzira tabas adam. In your mind, you're planning to turn it into a ring for a human being. At which point, when it becomes in service of a human being, it's going to become tamei. This is called yerdin letuma. You want the utensil to go down into a state of vulnerability to impurity. Therefore, all that's needed is harezu mekabeles tuma b'machshavazu. Just this thought alone makes it already able to become tamei. Uki'ilu nasis la'adam mitchilas asiyasa, and it's as though we treat it as if it was made to begin with to serve human beings. Chazar v'choshav aleha. Remember, all you had is one thought. Now you have a second thought. Like, you know what? Let me leave it around the goat. Let me leave it as a ring servicing an animal. So now this is called machshava, trying to be mevatel miyad machshava. You already had one thought that made it vulnerable to impurity, and now you want to have a second thought and undo that first thought. Afal pisha lein niskashet b'adamim, if no human being used it yet. It was all in your mind. Harezu mekabelas tuma, it continues to be vulnerable to impurity. She'ein hamachshava mevateles miyad hamachshava, because the second thought cannot undo the first thought. Ad sheyasem ma'isa, until you actually do an action. Kagen sheyashuv v'yisa yisakna k'ma'isa shel behema. You must do an action like, let's say, either polish it down or smooth it down or fix it up to be the shape of, or for use for an animal. So that's an example of two of the rules here. Keilim yerdin l'tuma b'machshava, and machshava is not mevatel miyad machshava. Let's go to the flip side. Hoysa tabas la'adam. It was a human ring. Here's a picture of the human ring. Okay, here we have it. A tabas for the person. In this state, it's vulnerable to impurity. V'chishev aleh lebehema, and all you did was in your mind, you're thinking, you know what, I want to make this into a little ankle ring for my animal. So now you're trying to get the ring out of being impure. The thought itself is not enough. It still remains vulnerable to impurity. Because the utensils cannot leave their vulnerability to impurity just by thought alone. If you did an action to it, and you change it to the size or the shape or whatever it is to make it fit for an animal, then then it's not able to become tamei anymore. Because the action that you're taking now undoes the previous action. And the same is true in all similar situations. So now we've demonstrated this concept that when it comes to making Keilim potentially impure, all that's required is a thought. To make it potentially pure, what's required is an action. And once you have a thought that makes it impure, no other thought can undo that except for an action. An important rule to remember. A deaf mute, a mentally unstable person, or a child has the power of action according to halacha, but not thought. As we explained in the last set of laws, when it comes to making food mukhshar, ready or fit to become tamei. Which means, in this scenario, if a deaf mute or a mentally unstable person or a child has a thought about turning an animal ring into a human ring, it does nothing. It doesn't make it now impure because his machshava is meaningless. On the other hand, if you had a human ring and comes along one of these people and does an action to make it for an animal ring, he does improve the state of that ring, and now it's no longer vulnerable to becoming impure. Halacha Yud Beis, zug shel deles shechashav alav lebehema. You have a doorbell. Okay, something like this. I know before I used it as an example of a ring of a door. We'll call it a doorbell. But imagine it's actually a bell, because I need to change it to another bell in a second. Zug shel deles shechishev alav lebehema. You have a doorbell that you, in your mind, you want to change it to now being used as a animal bell. Where's my animal bell picture? Here it is. Mikabel tuma. At this point, it's now able to become impure. Remember we said that a zug shel deles is an example of a non-vulnerable to impurity type of bell, but a bell around an animal, even though it seemingly serves as an animal, since it also is mashmiya koila adam, makes noise for people, it's mikabel tuma. So here, just a thought, again, yerdin lidei tuma b'machshava. However, v'shel behema shel asol ledeles, when it goes the other way, you have a bell of an animal that's now vulnerable to impurity. You want to make it into a doorbell which is going to be non-vulnerable. So what did we say? You have to do an action. Says the Rambam, by describing the halacha, he gives you another law about this action. The action has to be done to the actual bell, not to what you do with the bell. Afilu chibre bekarka, even if you attach the bell to the ground, like to the wall of the house, which is attached to the ground. Afilu kaveh b'masmer, even if you bang it in with a nail, hareza mekabel tuma, it's still vulnerable to impurity on account of being an animal bell, kishahaya as it was, ad sheyashana b'maisa begufay, till you do an action with the body of the bell. When we say action, action must be done to the object. Halacha Yud Gimel, uman shu oiseh, umaniach zugin. You have an artisan, a bell artisan, this is his job. He makes bells and he puts them down, but he doesn't say what they're for. Lidlasa is v'lebehema. It could be used for doorbells, it could be used for animal. So what do we consider them during this state? Are they considered for animals and they're mekabel tumah or not? It says that Rambam, if the majority is made for things that are able to become tamei, then everything by default is able to become tamei. Till you set aside those things actively to the thing that's not mekabel tumah, like for the doorbells. But if the majority of bells are made for, let's say, doors that are not mekabel tumah, so by default it's all pure. Till you put aside a part of them to animal use, which is mekabel tuma. And the same is true of all similar situations. Yudalid v'zugin anim tzayin b'chol makom. When you find a bell randomly, not in an artisan's home, mekabel tuma by default, it is mekabel tuma. We assume it's for animals. Chutz min anim tzayin bakrakim, unless you find them in large cities. Over there, they're mostly used for doors, which are not mekabel tuma. Tesvav amar leuman. If a person, a customer, tells a craftsman, asei li shnei zugin, please make me 2 bells. Echad ledeles ve'echad levehema. One should be for a door, which is non-vulnerable to impurity, and one should be for an animal, which is. But you didn't say which. Asei li shtei machzaloi. So you told a mat weaver, make me 2 reed mats. Achas l'shchiva ve'achas la'oyalim. One should be for lying on, which was mekabel tuma, of course, and one for tents, which is not mekabel tuma. Or asei li shnei dinim, make me 2 sheets, you tell a weaver. Echad l'tzurais ve'echad la'oyalim. One for art and one for covering a tent. So one is able to become tamei, one is not able to become tamei. Hare shnei and mekabel tuma, says the Rambam, we go stringently. By default, they're both able to become tamei ad sheyefarish v'yoymar, until you specify and you say zeh lekach v'zeh lekach. This is for the vulnerable impure use, and this is for the completely pure use, and then that one at that point becomes tahor and no longer able to become tamei.